Changes to the timeline are imminent. Huge buffs incoming on March 17th on PC and a couple of months later on console to the Intel specialization in Star Trek Online. And before we get started, let me just say that I really love the way they've done this blog post and the way they've laid it out. They have the pitch here, which is telling us what it's all about. We've chosen to focus on simple revisions with a focus on just a few design goals, increased ease of use, increased feeling of usefulness, and increased impact on gameplay. Great. Then they give us the timing with a little header section on here. The changes will be detailed. Again, PC, March 17th, console a couple months later. Even though they don't give us a date for console, they don't keep console players in the dark, and it's a nice little reminder that console players exist. They realize you exist, and they're trying to let you know. They'll tell you as soon as they can. So, let's look at the details of this change. Without further ado, the following includes a list of all of our planned changes, which will be included in the upcoming update. Intel Ship Mechanic. Okay, let's start with the big one. Gather Intel/active sensor arrays. This is what you get when you have a full Intel ship with a Commander Intel seat. You get the Gather Intel ability. How does it work? Currently, how it works is you have a primary target selected. You hit Gather Intel. Once per second, you gain a stack of penetrating scan. Once you have enough stacks of penetrating scan, which again at the moment depends on the rank of the enemy, they will become vulnerable. They'll become vulnerable for a period of time, where you can then use an expose ability. That expose ability will apply a different debuff depending on which one you choose. You could be debuffing their damage, debuffing their resistance so they take more damage, or debuffing their cooldowns so that they can't use their abilities as often. We also have some really nice developer notes from James Randall Bordicus, who is the senior systems designer. We'll be reading those as we go through. I really appreciate these. It gives us some insight into what the developers were thinking. I've already read them, and I really, really like them. Okay, so what are the changes to Gather Intel? Now, it only takes 6 stacks of penetrating scan to cause vulnerability on any rank of ship instead of varying by rank. It used to take up to 15 seconds. Now it will be 6 seconds on all enemies. The duration of the vulnerability is increased from 15 seconds to 30 seconds. Stacks of penetrating scan will not be applied while the target has vulnerability or if an expose ability is presently active. So if they've already reached the maximum number of stacks, they will no longer gain more stacks, and if they're debuffed, they won't gain stacks then either. All expose abilities now immediately expire any existing vulnerability, which is just a fancy way of saying they have a vulnerability window of 30 seconds. If you apply the debuff during that window, they will no longer be vulnerable, so other people, for example, couldn't double dip on your vulnerability and apply a second debuff. So, NPCs no longer benefit from a lockout period after the vulnerability expires. Basically just means they will no longer have an immunity to these debuff after the last one finishes, so you can go ahead and immediately start rebuilding your 6 stacks to debuff them again. Players will now benefit from a 30-second lockout instead of 15 seconds, so if you're doing PvP, you get hit with a vulnerability, they hit you with a debuff, the debuff expires, you will now have 30-second immunity before they can start building stacks on you again. Okay, so does this address the issue with the Gather Intel mechanic? Before I give my verdict, let's read what JR had to say. While the most common player feedback included suggestions of moving the stacks of penetrating scan to being self-targeted, and we'll talk about that in a second, we chose not to pursue this for now, as it both removes the multiplayer aspect of being able to build stacks more quickly with multiple players scanning, and also makes it similar enough to the command specs inspiration mechanic to invade on that identity. This also trends into major rework territory, which we chose to avoid where possible at this particular set of updates. Instead, we're speeding up the ability's application and improving its reusability, as well as cleaning up some messy stacking behavior that previously existed. Right, so the big problem with this ability was that enemies were dying before you could get it off. If it was going to take up to 15 seconds to be able to apply the debuff, the enemy was already dead or significantly damaged to the point that the debuff didn't have a lot of value. So we are basically cutting that in third. Is that an improvement? Yes, it is. Now you only have to wait 6 seconds instead of 12 or 15 or whatever the case may be. However, enemies still die really quickly, so you're going to be able to use it more often. It's definitely a buff that's worthwhile. I don't think it really necessarily completely fixes the issue with the ability. Also, another issue is they said they didn't want it to be self-targeted. So if you think of World of Warcraft, you think of a rogue. It used to be combo points would stack on the enemies. Then they changed it so they stack on the rogue. That way you weren't losing your combo points when you switched targets. People wanted a similar thing here so that your penetrating scan stacks could carry with you from target to target. That way if your target died, you'd be able to pick up where you left off with the next target. Other problem is that completely ruins the thematic aspect of the ability. You're gathering information about your particular target and any vulnerabilities unique to that target, so then you can then exploit them. So I think that doing it that way would make the ability better, but it would also destroy any immersion impact that the ability has. Okay, moving on. A lot of bridge officer abilities got hit as well. And when I say hit, I mean buffed. This is massive buffs across the board. Evade, target, lock. Base duration of the disable untargetable increased from 1, 2, or 3 seconds depending on rank to 2, 3, and 4 seconds, and now scales with control expertise, meaning this is now considered a control ability and it will interact with everything in the game that has to do with control abilities. The big one obviously being unconventional systems, and we're going to see this as a little minor theme throughout the blog here. Other abilities are getting this treatment as well. The duration of the disable is now subject to control resistances of the affected foe. Makes sense. If this is a control effect, control resistance should be able to resist it. Replaced accuracy penalty with a damage penalty. Affected foes now suffer reduced damage against the user of this ability instead of just missing them more frequently. Their damage output against other targets is unaffected. I like this change because consistently reduced damage is better than rolling the dice and just hoping they have more misses. Duration of all ranks are now normalized to 20 seconds. That's a nice improvement. Here's the developer comments. Accuracy debuffs are difficult mechanic to feel or even to verify their effectiveness using combat log parsing. I really like this because it acknowledges that the community, or at least some aspects of the community at the high-end level, place an emphasis on parsing the combat logs that the game generates, even though it's us doing it on our own without any official support from the developers. And that we do take these things into consideration when deciding how to play the game, how to build our ships, and how to decide what is appealing to us or not when we're going to buy a ship or choosing something to use. So that's very useful information. Replacing interactions also seems like... replacing this with a damage penalty maintains the feel of the design while gaining a more verifiable impact. Adding in skill interactions also seems like an obvious choice. They are referring to making it a control ability. So it will interact with, for example, with an inhibiting secondary deflector. All right, next up is Intelligence Team, a very good ability that already sees quite a bit of use. So how did they change this? Threat reduction values at all ranks have been doubled. Excellent. If threatening stance is not active on the recipient of this ability, this effect is doubled again. Excellent. Targeting stealth values are now consistent across all ranks, equal to previous rank 3 values. Excellent. Defense buff increased from, hold on, wait for it, went from 10, 15, and 20, depending on rank, to 30, 40, 50. That is more than double, depending on the rank you're talking about. Excellent, excellent increase. If you just slotted an ensign intel team, you're now getting 30 defense from that, as well as the extra threat reduction. This is going to be a much more appealing ability for DPS players and team-based content, especially if you have a dedicated tank in the group. It's just going to make it even stronger. Before, it wasn't really being used so much because it wasn't a control ability. It was only really being used for stealth builds with Exodus Acta Probat, but I think this change is quite nice, and it's a change that just goes along with an ability that's already popular. Also added a perception buff to the recipient, which scales with rank. Probably not that useful, but whatever. Developer notes, with these changes, we think the power now has a unique niche to fill as a threat modifier ability. Improving the targeting stealth values associated with rank 1 and 2 may also allow those abilities to fill a role they were previously too weak to effectively fill. This ability also remains the sole means of removing the debuffs from gather intel in PvP scenarios, so this may have more of an impact in PvP than it does in PvE. So for both of you, I hope you enjoy it. Okay, Subspace Beacon. Next ability on the block here. All ranks now have the same distance limit of 20 kilometers. Let me just say up front, not a big fan of this ability. It's one of those teleporting abilities, and I just don't like those in this game for whatever reason. Just doesn't feel right to me. Added a brief period of untargetable after the teleport. That's nice. Teleport will now reset all threat when threatening stance is not active. Also nice. Added a bridge officer cooldown reduction to the teleport, which scales with rank. That's also very nice as well. Probably the nicest part about this, although you're probably going to not want to have to rely on this for cooldown reduction, so you're going to want to have a sufficient amount built into your build already such that you don't want this, like, you're not going to ever need it when it happens. If you need it when you get it, then your build's already screwed up. So it's sort of like, I don't know that this really, they're all nice buffs, I just don't know that it's really going to make this more appealing to use, if that makes sense. Added some clarifying text, you can read that on your own. Fixed some errors, you can read that on your own, and that's just good. It's bug fixes, it's correction to the tooltips, all that kind of stuff, very useful. In addition to adding utility in the form of a threat dump and scaling buff cooldown reductions, this review offered us an opportunity to fix text omissions and functionality errors that have been present for a long while. Win-win. Again, maybe other people will feel differently. I just don't like the feel of teleport abilities. Adding the threat dump and the cooldown reduction is certainly very helpful, so I do think it's a really nice buff. It's a very significant buff, and maybe people will want to use it now. Alright, Electromagnetic Pulse Probe. This was already sort of a stealth control ability. We knew it interacted with control mechanics, but it wasn't labeled as such. Now it is going to be properly labeled. Flight speed increased by 50% at all ranks. Very nice. Added electrical damage to the probe's pulses, which foes within 2 kilometers will take some damage now. Is this going to be good damage? I don't know, but people were already using this ability anyway, so adding some extra damage on sounds good to me. Damage now scales with particle generator skill. Okay, that seems good. You'll be able to buff it up. Disabled duration now scales with control expertise because it's now properly being labeled as a control ability. Base duration of pulsing disable, not the final detonation, has been reduced and benefits less from control expertise, so they're kind of just swapping that around. Now the duration scales with it, but the pulsing scales less. Probe will no longer detonate until at least 10 seconds have passed, even if launched at very close range. This power is now labeled as a control bridge officer ability and can interact with applicable effects and triggers such as secondary deflectors, so that's a really nice change as well. Developer notes, by traveling faster, living longer, and utilizing the skills of its owner, our hope is that this friendly little nuisance gains a footing as a valid alternative to other bridge officer abilities. Like I said before, this is already an ability that people are using due to its interaction with unconventional systems, so I do think that this buff is going to be quite nice for people who are already using it. Ionic Turbulence. Projectile now travels to its destination approximately 3 times as quickly. Very nice. Damage resistance debuff increased slightly at all ranks and now scales higher with aux power. Very nice. Speed debuff now scales with control expertise. Excellent. I think we can all see where this is going. We're mentioning control expertise. This power is now labeled as a control bridge officer ability and can interact with applicable effects and triggers such as secondary deflectors and unconventional systems. Fix this, so it's just going to give us another choice for unconventional systems, and it's just stronger. So if you were wanting to use it anyway, now it's more powerful. Fix a series of errors with the ability. That's bug fixes are always nice to see. Developer notes. Primary player feedback focused on travel speed and debuff severity as compared to alternative buff ability choices. Our internal reviews supported this feedback and became the focus of the updates applied to this ability. Alright, next up is Kinetic Magnet. This is kind of a fun one, I must admit. Increased kinetic resistance debuff at all ranks from 20, 25, and 30 to 30, 40, and 50. Now, I believe Kinetic Magnet goes from Lieutenant to Commander, so the lowest seat you're going to be able to slot this on is a Lieutenant, but still getting 30 kinetic damage resistance debuff on a Lieutenant ability is pretty good, because it was only 20 before. Duration of all ranks are now normalized to 15 seconds. The number of mines and torpedoes that can be drawn to an affected target has been increased from 3 to 6. I do feel like Relocate Mines has kind of stolen the thunder of this ability a little bit, but having said that, Relocate Mines was a very necessary and needed captain ability. The range at which mines and torpedoes can be drawn to an affected target has been increased from 5 kilometers to 10 kilometers. That's actually a very big and very good change to this ability. Reminder, this ability no longer has fragile damage cap removed in a previous update. What idiot would have missed that? Clearly, I think everyone knew when it came out. Wait, what's that? I didn't know about it either. I'm one of the idiots who didn't notice it at the time. Oh, okay. Well, okay. Seems that I'm one of the idiots who didn't know about this. So, yeah, maybe you didn't either. Yeah, that was a big problem with this ability, was that it had a damage cap that was very low, and so what would happen is that you would use it, the enemy would, get hit with a stiff breeze, and then, it would be broken, and then it wouldn't be useful anymore. So maybe with all of these changes, it'll actually see some use, at least on a support build. I don't know for sure, but these are all good changes nonetheless. Okay, developer notes, such a clever ability that sees so little use, which suggests to me that I don't know if that's based on feeling, if it's based on community feedback, or if it's based on actual metrics they track behind the scenes. Many players that offered feedback did not seem to know that the fragility limits were removed long ago. In a galaxy far, far... Wait, wrong franchise. Hopefully these numeric improvements may allow it to find a place among players that enjoy using kinetic damage to defeat their foes, and at least make players curious enough of its potential to take another look at it. So, very positive changes there. Alright, moving on to Surgical Strikes, and this is a firing mode. I will say right up front, the biggest problem with any specialization firing mode is that they do not have any extenders, and this has not been addressed. Increased damage multipliers at all ranks, up 30% at rank 1, 40% at rank 2, and 50% at rank 3. That's a significant damage increase. Standardize the amount of crit chance and accuracy at all ranks to 30%, which should make it better at lower ranks if you don't have a full intel seat or you want the commander intel power for something else. Although I think if you have a commander intel power and you want to use surgical strikes, you should definitely use it as your commander power. Added a scaling amount of crit severity to all ranks, 40% at rank 1, 60% at rank 2, and 80% at rank 3. That is a whopping huge amount. Okay, developer notes. Updating this power was tricky. Since the improvements made to Beam Overload a few years back, its identity has been mired. Coupled with poor numeric performance, the ability languished unused and was especially true for high-end players who already itemized for high crit chance, as there comes a point where more critical chance isn't a meaningful choice for your build. That's very, very true, and it suggests that they really are paying attention to the feedback left by the high-end community. While the boosted damage multiplier was a bit of a no-brainer, this would not address the underlying use case for those high-end players, namely the aforementioned already being, really high on crit chance. And so an additional crit severity boost has also been rolled into the ability. With this added, our hope is that this ability will now be a viable choice to some degree for players at all progression levels. Is the extra crit severity and damage enough to overcome the fact that you're only ever going to get 2/3 uptime at best? I don't know, and I don't think so. It certainly makes it better, 100%, and I think that it's a nice change. I would like to see a starship trait that just extends all specialization firing modes by 5 seconds. Not only will that cover all the ones that already exist, but it will also cover any ones that may come out again in the future. Alright, Transport Warhead. Removed firing arc requirements. Recharge time reduced from 30 seconds to 15 seconds. I'm already on the third take. I am not editing out those sirens or starting over again. Sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it. Okay, so Transport Warhead is an ability that I have a soft spot for. It does trigger subspatial warheads, so it's one of those things every once in a while I say, I'm going to go ahead and use it again. Especially on a commander, intel ship. You don't know what to do with that commander power. Developer notes, by giving players an ability that removes the firing arc restrictions on one of the weapon types, our hope is that this ability now has a useful niche it can fill, especially for ships on the lower end of maneuverability that wish to use torpedoes. Alongside the drastic reduction to the ability's cooldown, it is now more readily usable more frequently. Truthfully, this ability could benefit from further review and tuning, but the complexity of its underlying structure prevented much additional improvements without a drastic rebuild. What I like about this is that it could benefit from further review and tuning, suggesting they're open to more suggestions and they're open to making more changes and tweaks based on feedback, which I really, really like. So, what feedback would I give specifically for Transport Warhead? The biggest issue with the ability for me is the long variable time that you have to wait for detonation. The way it currently stands, it transports the warhead to the enemy ship. Then you have to wait between 2 and 6 seconds, randomly chosen, before it will actually detonate. 6 seconds can be too long, and it might make it so that it never actually fires because someone else comes in with a hit and kills the enemy, and then you don't get your damage. If you want to keep the thematic reason, right, because the variable time it takes to detonate is sort of thematic. It's like finding a mine or a torpedo or whatever that hasn't gone off yet, and it's really volatile and you don't know when it's going to detonate. Maybe reduce it to 1 to 2 seconds so that you never have to wait more than 2 seconds for it to detonate. I think a 2-second penalty is okay because if you fired a torpedo normally, you would have to wait for it to travel to the target. So since it's instantaneous, a 2-second wait is tolerable, but 6 seconds is not tolerable. So I think a big tweak there is to change the range from 2 to 6 to 1 to 2 or maybe even 1 to 3. And then also it doesn't have better uptime, right? Just make the duplicate cooldown a little shorter. That would probably help quite a bit. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the change. Thank you very much for watching. If you're on PC, look for these changes on March 17th. If you're on console, just keep your eyes and ears open, and hopefully it will come to you guys soon. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all my channel members. As always, take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.